My future mother-in-law took scissors to my wedding dress at 2 a.m. the night before my ceremony, leaving shreds of ivory silk scattered across my hotel room floor like confetti from hell. What Margaret Hayes didn't know was that I'd been planning for her sabotage for months, and when I walked down that aisle the next morning, her face went white as the dress I was wearing. Let me back up and tell you how a 47-year-old woman who thought she'd missed her chance at happily ever after ended up in the middle of the most vindictive family drama of her life, and how I turned it into the most satisfying victory I've ever experienced. I'm Elena Rodriguez, and for the past 15 years, I've been the kind of woman who keeps everyone else's life running smoothly, while mine quietly fell apart. After my divorce at 32, I threw myself into being the dependable one, the sister who planned every family gathering, the friend who showed up with casseroles during hard times, the colleague who stayed late to help others meet their deadlines. I managed a small but successful event planning business in Sacramento, specializing in intimate celebrations for people who wanted something meaningful rather than flashy. I was good at making other people's dreams come true. My own dreams had been carefully folded away like winter clothes in summer, stored somewhere I didn't have to look at them every day. I'd convinced myself that romance was for younger women, that I'd had my chance and it didn't work out, and that was fine. I had my work, my small circle of friends, my cozy craftsman house with the garden I'd spent years perfecting. It was a good life, even if it was a quiet one. Then I met David Hayes at the farmer's market on a Saturday morning in October. I was there early, as always, selecting flowers for a client's anniversary party. He was standing in front of the apple vendor, looking completely lost, holding his phone like it might contain the secrets of the universe. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with salt and pepper hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it, and the kind of laugh lines that told you he'd spent a lot of years finding joy in small things. "Excuse me," he said, approaching me, with the sheepish smile of a man who knew he was about to reveal his incompetence. "I'm supposed to buy apples for my daughter's pie baking experiment, but I have no idea what kind to get." The vendor just listed about 12 varieties and I nodded like I understood, but honestly, I thought there were maybe 3 types of apples in the world. I laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd had in weeks. Granny Smith for tart, Honeycrisp for sweet, or Braeburn if she wants something in between that holds its shape well when baked. His whole face lit up. "You're an angel. I'm David, by the way, father of one very ambitious 16-year-old who decided she wants to master French pastry this semester. Elena. And tell your daughter that the secret to a perfect apple pie is mixing 2 varieties and adding just a pinch of cardamom." We ended up talking for 45 minutes. He told me about his daughter Sarah, a junior in high school who wanted to be a chef. I told him about my business, how I'd started it after my divorce as a way to create something beautiful when my own life felt like it was crumbling. He was a high school history teacher, recently relocated from Portland after accepting a position at one of Sacramento's better schools. His wife had died 4 years earlier from cancer, and he and Sarah had moved to California for a fresh start. There was something about David that felt immediately comfortable, like talking to someone I'd known for years rather than minutes. He was the kind of man who actually listened when you spoke, who asked follow-up questions because he was genuinely interested in your answers, not just waiting for his turn to talk. When he asked if I'd like to get coffee sometime, I almost said no out of habit. I'd trained myself not to expect those kinds of invitations anymore, but something about the way he smiled, patient and hopeful without being pushy, made me say yes. Our first date lasted 6 hours. We met for coffee at 11 in the morning and ended up at dinner, talking about everything from his students' latest historical reenactment disasters to my most challenging clients, to the books we'd both been meaning to read for years. He walked me to my car afterward, and when he asked if he could see me again, I didn't hesitate. The next 8 months unfolded like the kind of love story I'd stopped believing in. David was steady in a way I'd never experienced, reliable without being boring, romantic without being over the top. He brought me coffee from my favorite shop every Tuesday morning, not because it was on his way to work, but because he'd learned. It was the day I always struggled to get moving. He remembered that I loved white roses, but thought red ones were too dramatic for everyday gestures. He listened to me talk about my clients' events with genuine interest, offering thoughtful suggestions that actually improved my work. More importantly, he saw me. Not the version of myself I presented to make other people comfortable. Not the helpful friend or the competent professional, but the woman who dreamed of traveling to Tuscany and learning to paint watercolors and maybe, someday, having someone to share quiet Sunday mornings with. He saw that I'd spent years making myself smaller to fit into other people's expectations, and he never asked me to shrink. When Sarah started joining us for dinners and weekend activities, I was nervous. I'd never dated a man with children, and teenagers were basically a foreign species to me. But Sarah was curious and kind, asking me about my work and sharing stories about her culinary adventures. She started texting me pictures of her latest baking experiments, asking for advice on presentation and flavor combinations. Within a few months, she was calling me Elena instead of Ms. Rodriguez, and I was helping her plan a small dinner party for her friends. It felt like the family I'd never known I wanted. David proposed on a Thursday evening in May, in my garden, while I was deadheading the roses. No big production, no hidden photographers, just him kneeling in the dirt beside me with a simple solitaire ring and the words, "Elena, you've made everything in my life better, and I want to spend whatever time I have left making your life better too. Will you marry me?" I said yes before he'd even finished the question. We decided on a small ceremony in September, just family and close friends in the garden I'd spent years cultivating. Sarah was thrilled, immediately diving into wedding planning with the enthusiasm she usually reserved for soufflés. My sister Carmen was my matron of honor, and my handful of close friends were excited to see me finally putting myself first for once. The only complication was Margaret Hayes, David's mother. From the moment David told her about our engagement, Margaret made it clear that she did not approve. Not of me, not of the timeline, not of the fact that her son was moving on with his life. She'd moved to Sacramento 6 months after David and Sarah, ostensibly to be closer to her granddaughter. But I suspected it was more about maintaining control over her son's life. Margaret was 72, impeccably groomed, and had the kind of sharp tongue that could cut glass. She'd been widowed for 10 years, and had apparently spent that time perfecting the art of subtle cruelty disguised as concern. Every interaction with her felt like a test I was destined to fail. "It's lovely that David found companionship," she told me the first time we met, making companionship sound like something you'd find at an animal shelter. Though I do hope you understand that Sarah will always be his priority. Children from previous relationships can be so complicated and blended. Families. I bit back the urge to point out that I'd never had children, so there was no blending required, and that Sarah and I got along beautifully. Instead, I smiled and agreed that Sarah was wonderful. Margaret's disapproval only intensified as the wedding approached. She criticized everything from the venue choice to the menu to my decision to wear ivory instead of white. "At your age, dear, don't you think something more subtle would be appropriate? Perhaps a nice navy suit?" When I showed her the dress I'd chosen, a simple but elegant A-line gown with delicate lace sleeves that I'd found at a boutique in San Francisco, she pursed her lips like she'd tasted something sour. "How modern," she said, which was clearly not a compliment. The dress was perfect for me. Not too young, not trying too hard, just beautiful and comfortable and exactly what I wanted to wear when I married the man I loved. It had cost more than I usually spent on myself, but for once in my life I decided I deserved something special. David noticed his mother's behavior but seemed genuinely baffled by it. "She'll come around," he kept saying. "She's just having trouble adjusting to changes. She was so close to Rebecca, and I think she feels like she's being disloyal to her memory. I understood grief and loyalty, but Margaret's behavior felt like something darker than mourning. It felt like warfare disguised as family concern. 2 weeks before the wedding, Margaret offered to help with final preparations. "I insist," she said when I politely declined. "You're going to be family, and family helps family." Against my better judgment, I let her coordinate the flowers and handle some of the vendor communications. She was efficient and thorough, and, for a brief moment, I wondered if David had been right about her coming around. I should have trusted my instincts. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came 3 days before the wedding, when I called the florist to confirm the delivery. Time for the ceremony arrangements? Linda Martinez, who I'd worked with dozens of times for client events, sounded confused when I asked about the white roses and eucalyptus we'd selected. "Elena, honey, I thought you changed your mind about those. Your future mother-in-law called yesterday and said you wanted to switch to red carnations and baby's breath instead. She said you realized the roses were too expensive and wanted something more budget-friendly." My stomach dropped. Red carnations and baby's breath were exactly the kind of generic cheap arrangement that screamed we didn't care enough to try. More importantly, I'd never spoken to Margaret about the flowers, and I certainly hadn't authorized her to make changes to my wedding. "Linda, I never approved that change. Can we switch back to the original order?" "Of course, but it might be tight. Let me see what I can do." I hung up and immediately called Margaret. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice honey-sweet with false innocence. "Elena, dear, how nice to hear from you. I hope you're not calling with more wedding stress. You've seemed so overwhelmed lately." "Margaret, I just spoke with the florist. She said you changed the flower order?" "Oh, that. Yes, I took the liberty of making a more practical choice. Those white roses were really quite extravagant, don't you think? I've been to hundreds of weddings and no one remembers the flowers anyway. I thought it would be better to put that money towards something more meaningful." The casual way she dismissed my choices, as if my preferences were childish whims that needed adult supervision, made my hands shake with anger. But I kept my voice level. "Margaret, I appreciate your concern about the budget, but those were the flowers David and I chose together. I'd like to keep the original order." "Of course, dear. It's your wedding." Her tone suggested it was actually a child's tea party, that she was humoring. "I just thought a woman of your age might appreciate a more understated approach. But if you want to make a statement, that's certainly your choice." I called Linda back and confirmed the white roses. But Margaret's interference left me unsettled. It wasn't just about flowers. It was about boundaries, respect, and the clear message that she intended to override my decisions whenever she felt like it. The next incident happened the following day. Sarah called me sounding upset. "Elena, I'm so sorry, but I think there's been a miscommunication about the cake." "What kind of miscommunication?" "Grandma Margaret came with me to the final cake tasting. She told the baker that you'd changed your mind about the lemon cake with raspberry filling and wanted vanilla with vanilla buttercream instead. She said you thought the other flavor was too adventurous for a mature bride." Mature bride. The "we" phrase hit like a slap. Margaret was systematically erasing every personal touch I'd chosen, replacing them with bland, generic alternatives, while framing it as age-appropriate choices for someone who should know better than to want anything special. "Sarah, did you hear me say I wanted to change the cake?" "No, and that's why I'm calling. The lemon cake was perfect, and you seemed so excited about it. But Grandma was very insistent, and she said you'd asked her to handle the change because you were too busy." I closed my eyes and counted to 10. Margaret was not just overstepping, she was manipulating Sarah, putting her in the middle of an adult conflict and making her feel responsible for fixing problems she didn't create. "Don't worry about it, sweetheart. I'll call the baker and get it sorted out. You didn't do anything wrong." But when I called the bakery, they told me it was too late to change back. The vanilla cake was already in production, and they didn't Have time to make a new lemon cake by Saturday. I was starting to see the pattern. Margaret wasn't just expressing opinions or making suggestions. She was actively sabotaging my wedding while maintaining plausible deniability. Every change was framed as being more appropriate, more practical, more suitable for someone my age. She was systematically stripping away everything that made this wedding personal and meaningful, turning it into the kind of generic ceremony that could belong to anyone. When I told David about the incidents, he looked genuinely troubled but still seemed to think it was a misunderstanding rather than deliberate sabotage. Mom's always been controlling, but she means well. She probably thinks she's helping by making what she considers more practical choices. Let me talk to her. David, she didn't make suggestions. She went behind my back and changed things without asking me. That's not helping. That's sabotage. I know it seems that way, but she's not malicious. She's just used to being in charge of things. She organized Rebecca's funeral, planned Sarah's birthday parties for years, handled all the family events. She probably doesn't realize she's overstepping. I wanted to shake him. Margaret's behavior wasn't the result of good intentions gone wrong. It was a calculated campaign to establish dominance and make it clear that my preferences didn't matter. But David had been dealing with his mother's controlling behavior for so long that he'd normalized it, and he couldn't see how deliberate and cruel her actions were. The conversation with Margaret that David promised to have apparently went well, from his perspective. She apologized for the misunderstandings and assured him that she only wanted our day to be perfect. She even offered to come with me to pick up my dress from the alteration shop as a gesture of support and bonding. I should have said no. Every instinct told me to keep Margaret away from anything important to me. But David was so relieved that his mother was making an effort, and I was tired of being the difficult one who couldn't get along with his family. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The dress fitting went smoothly. The seamstress had done beautiful work, taking in the waist and shortening the hem to the perfect length. The dress fit like it had been made for me, elegant and flattering, without trying too hard to recapture a youth I'd never really had anyway. Margaret was surprisingly complimentary, admiring the craftsmanship and telling me I looked lovely. "You know, Elena, I owe you an apology," she said as we walked to the car afterward. "I realize I've been difficult about the wedding planning. It's just hard for me to see David moving on. Rebecca was like a daughter to me, and I suppose I've been feeling territorial about his happiness." It was the first genuine moment I'd had with her, and I felt a wave of relief. Maybe David had been right. Maybe she just needed time to adjust to the idea of him remarrying. "I understand that this transition is hard for you, Margaret. I'm not trying to replace Rebecca or take anything away from Sarah. I just want to love David and be part of your family." "Of course you do, dear. And I want that too. Which is why I think it would be lovely if I could keep your dress safe for you until the wedding. You're staying at that hotel downtown, and those rooms can be so cramped. I have plenty of space at my house, and I'll bring it to you Saturday morning. Consider it my wedding gift to you. One less thing for you to worry about." The offer seemed genuine, even thoughtful. I was staying at a small boutique hotel near the venue, and the room was indeed cramped. Having Margaret take responsibility for the dress would be one less detail to manage on an already busy morning. "That's very thoughtful of you. Are you sure it's not too much trouble?" "No trouble at all. I insist." I let her take the dress, feeling cautiously optimistic that maybe we'd turned a corner in our relationship. Maybe she really had just needed time to adjust, and now we could move forward as family. I spent Friday evening at the hotel with Carmen and my closest friends, having the kind of relaxed celebration I'd imagined. We ordered room service, painted our nails, and talked late into the night about love and second chances and how proud they were of me for being brave enough to try again. For the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely excited about the wedding rather than anxious about managing family drama. Carmen fell asleep on the pull-out sofa around midnight, but I was too keyed up to sleep. I sat by the window, looking out. at the city lights and thinking about how different my life would be in 24 hours. I'd be Elena Hayes, wife and stepmother, part of a real family for the first time since my divorce. The thought filled me with a warm contentment I hadn't felt in years. At 2:17 a.m., my phone rang. I saw Margaret's name on the display, and my heart immediately started racing. No one calls with good news at 2 a.m. Margaret? Is everything okay? Elena, dear, I'm so sorry to wake you, but there's been a terrible accident. Her voice was shaking, and she sounded genuinely distressed. I was hanging your dress in my closet, and the rod collapsed. The dress fell, and somehow it got caught on some broken metal. I'm afraid it's been damaged. Damaged how badly? It's quite bad, dear. The fabric is torn in several places, and there are some stains from the closet rod. I'm absolutely mortified. I feel terrible about this. My hands were shaking as I gripped the phone. Can it be repaired? Maybe if I take it to an emergency seamstress? I don't think so, honey. The tears are quite extensive. I'm looking at it now, and I just don't see how it could be fixed in time. Margaret, I need to see it. Can you bring it to the hotel? Of course, but Elena, it's very late. Maybe you should try to get some sleep, and we can figure out a solution in the morning. I'm sure we can find you something appropriate to wear. There are several shops that open early, and I'd be happy to help you pick out something suitable. Something suitable. There it was again. That phrase that made everything I wanted sound unreasonable and childish. I'll be right over to get the dress. Elena, really, there's no point in upsetting yourself further tonight. The damage is done, and seeing it won't change anything. Let me handle this. I have some connections at a few boutiques, and I'm sure we can find something lovely for you tomorrow morning. But I was already putting on my shoes. What's your address? She gave it to me reluctantly, and I hung up without saying goodbye. Carmen stirred as I grabbed my car keys. Elena? What's wrong? Margaret says she damaged my dress. I'm going to... See how bad it is. At 2 a.m.? Can't it wait until morning? No. Something about this doesn't feel right. I drove across town to Margaret's house, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe the damage wasn't as bad as she'd made it sound. Maybe it could be repaired, or at least patched enough to get me through the ceremony. But even as I tried to stay optimistic, a cold certainty was settling in my stomach. Margaret answered the door in a robe, her hair perfectly styled despite the late hour. She led me to her bedroom, where my dress was laid out on the bed like a crime scene exhibit. It wasn't damaged. It was destroyed. The bodice had been cut into ribbons, the skirt shredded into strips of fabric that looked like they'd been put through a paper shredder. The delicate lace sleeves were in pieces, and there were dark stains that looked suspiciously like they came from a marker rather than a closet rod. I stared at the ruins of my dress, and the last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't an accident. This was Margaret's final solution to the problem of her son marrying a woman she didn't approve of. My God, Margaret, what did you do? Margaret's face shifted through a series of expressions: surprise, concern, and then something that looked almost like satisfaction before settling into practiced innocence. Elena, I told you there was an accident. I know it's upsetting, but these things happen. We'll find you something else to wear tomorrow. It's just a dress, after all. Just a dress. The casualness of her dismissal, the way she shrugged off the destruction of something that had meant so much to me, confirmed what I already knew in my bones. This hadn't been an accident. Margaret had deliberately destroyed my wedding dress 6 hours before my ceremony, and now she was standing there acting like I was being dramatic for being upset about it. I stood there for a long moment, looking at the shredded remains of my beautiful dress, feeling something cold and clear settle over me like armor. Every instinct screamed at me to confront her, to demand the truth, to call her out for the calculated cruelty of what she'd done. But as I stood there in her pristine bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of her sabotage, I realized something important. Getting angry wouldn't help me. Crying wouldn't fix this. Margaret wanted me to fall apart, to prove that I was too unstable and emotional to be part of her family. She wanted drama and tears and chaos that would justify her behavior, and maybe even postpone or cancel the wedding. She was counting on me to react like a victim. Instead, I pulled out my phone and took photos of the destroyed dress from multiple angles, documenting every cut, every stain, every piece of evidence that this hadn't been an accident. Margaret watched me with growing unease. "Elena, what are you doing?" "Documenting the damage for insurance purposes," I said calmly, continuing to photograph the scene. "This dress cost $1,800. My insurance will want detailed photos of the destruction." It was a lie. I had no intention of filing an insurance claim, but Margaret didn't know that, and I could see her calculating whether her story would hold up under scrutiny. The closet rod she claimed had collapsed was perfectly intact. There was no broken metal anywhere in the room. The cuts in the fabric were too precise, too systematic to be accidental damage. "I'm sure that won't be necessary," she said quickly. "I'll pay for a replacement dress. Let's not involve insurance companies in a simple household accident." "That's very generous of you, Margaret, though I'm not sure how we'll find an identical replacement by 10 a.m. I finished taking photos and slipped my phone back into my purse. Margaret was watching me with the expression of someone who'd expected an explosion and instead gotten ice-cold professionalism. "Elena, I hope you're not implying that I would deliberately damage your dress. That would be a terrible accusation to make about family." "I'm not implying anything, Margaret. I'm documenting what happened so we can figure out the best way to handle this situation." The truth was, I'd been expecting something like this. Not the dress specifically, but some kind of final sabotage attempt. Margaret had been escalating, her interference for weeks, testing boundaries and seeing how far she could push before anyone stopped her. The flowers, the cake, the constant undermining disguised as helpful suggestions, it had all been building to this moment. What Margaret didn't know was that I'd been preparing for her sabotage almost from the beginning. Not because I was paranoid, but because 15 years of running an event planning business had taught me that there's always someone who wants to ruin things, and the key to surviving their attempts is having backup plans they don't know about. "I should get back to the hotel," I said, gathering up the remains of my dress. "I'll need to figure out what I'm going to wear in a few hours." "Elena, wait. I feel terrible about this. Let me help you find something. I know several shops that open early, and I have connections that could get us in even sooner. We'll find you something lovely." The eagerness in her voice, the way she was already planning to control my emergency shopping trip, told me everything I needed to know about her next move. She wanted to come with me, to help me choose something appropriate, to make sure that whatever I ended up wearing would be another subtle humiliation, something that would make me look desperate or inappropriate or like exactly the kind of woman who didn't belong in her family. "Thank you, but I'll handle it." "But Elena, you don't know Sacramento stores like I do. You'll waste precious time, looking in the wrong places. Let me help you." "I appreciate the offer, but I've got it covered." Margaret's face tightened. She'd been counting on managing this crisis, on being the one who swooped in to save the day with a solution that would somehow prove her superiority and my dependence on her expertise. My calm refusal to let her control the aftermath was clearly not part of her plan. "Elena, I hope you're not angry with me about this accident. I would hate for a simple mishap to cause problems between us." "I'm not angry, Margaret. Accidents happen." The word accident hung in the air between us, and we both knew I didn't believe it for a second. But I also wasn't going to waste energy on a confrontation that wouldn't change anything. My dress was destroyed. The wedding was in 6 hours. I had more important things to do than argue with a woman who'd already shown me exactly who she was. Drove back to the hotel with the destroyed dress in my car, feeling strangely calm. By the time I got back to my room, Carmen was awake and waiting for me with coffee and the kind of concerned expression that meant she knew something terrible had happened. How bad is it? I showed her the photos on my phone. Carmen, who usually had something sarcastic to say about everything, was speechless for a full 30 seconds. Elena. This wasn't an accident. No, it wasn't. She destroyed your dress on purpose, 6 hours before your wedding. What kind of person does that? The kind of person who's been trying to sabotage this wedding from the beginning. Carmen was pacing now, her anger radiating off her in waves. We have to tell David. He needs to know what his mother did. And say what? That I think she deliberately destroyed my dress? She'll deny it, and he'll want to believe her. It'll turn into a he said she said situation that will overshadow the entire wedding. So you're just going to let her get away with this? I looked at my sister, who'd been protecting me from bullies since we were children, and smiled. Who says I'm letting her get away with anything? Carmen studied my face, clearly trying to figure out what I was thinking. Elena Rodriguez, what are you planning? I'm planning to get married today. In a beautiful dress, in my garden, surrounded by people who love David and me. Margaret's sabotage isn't going to stop that from happening. But what dress? Everything decent is going to be closed until at least 9, and you need to be getting ready by 8 if you want to have time for hair and makeup. I know exactly what dress I'm going to wear. 3 hours later, I was standing in my hotel bathroom, putting the finishing touches on my makeup while Carmen sat on the bed, shaking her head in amazement. I can't believe you've had a backup dress this entire time and never told me. I didn't think I'd need it, but when Margaret started interfering with everything else, I decided it was better to be safe than sorry. The backup dress was hanging on the closet door, still in its garment bag. I'd bought it 2 months ago after the first incident with the flowers and kept it in my office safe. It was different from my original choice, but no less beautiful, a tea-length dress in champagne silk with a subtle beaded neckline. Elegant and sophisticated without trying to compete with a 20-something bride. It was the dress of a woman who knew exactly who she was and wasn't apologizing for it. Where did you even find something like this on short notice? I didn't. I bought it after Margaret changed the flower order. I had a feeling she wasn't done interfering, so I wanted to make sure I had options. Carmen was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. Elena, this is diabolical. I'm so proud of you right now. It's not diabolical. It's just good planning. But as I slipped into the backup dress and looked at myself in the mirror, I felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with good planning and everything to do with the knowledge that Margaret's attempts to ruin my day had failed. She'd destroyed my first dress, but she had no idea that I'd been 3 steps ahead of her sabotage attempts. The dress fit perfectly, and it was actually more flattering than my original choice. The champagne color brought out the gold in my brown eyes, and the beading caught the light in a way that made me look luminous. Most importantly, it was a dress that Margaret had never seen, never had a chance to criticize or undermine or replace, with something more suitable. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Good morning, beautiful. Can't wait to marry you today. Mom's bringing your dress by around 9, right? Love you. I stared at the message for a moment, then typed back, change of plans. Margaret had an accident with the dress last night, but don't worry, I have everything handled. See you at the altar. Love you too. Almost immediately, my phone started ringing. David's name appeared on the screen, and I could imagine the panic in his voice. I let it go to voicemail. He called again, then again. Finally, I texted, getting. Ready now. Can't talk. Don't worry about the dress situation. I promise you'll love what I'm wearing. Focus on getting yourself ready. This is going to be the best day of our lives. Carmen was watching me with a mixture of admiration and concern. Are you going to tell him what really happened? Eventually. But not today. Today is about David, and me and the beginning of our marriage. Margaret doesn't get to make it about her drama. I turned back to the mirror, fastening the pearl earrings that had been my grandmother's, and felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. Margaret had tried to take away my choices, my agency, my right to look beautiful on my wedding day. She'd counted on me being devastated, dependent on her help, willing to accept whatever scraps of dignity she decided to throw my way. Instead, I was going to walk down the aisle in a dress she'd never seen, looking exactly how I wanted to look, proving that her sabotage had been not just cruel, but completely pointless. She'd destroyed my dress, but she hadn't touched my joy, my confidence, or my determination to marry the man I loved. The best part was going to be the look on her face when she realized that all her scheming had accomplished nothing except revealing her true nature to everyone who mattered. By 8:30, I was ready. Hair perfect, makeup flawless, dress spectacular. Carmen had tears in her eyes as she handed me my bouquet. White roses and eucalyptus, exactly what I'd originally chosen, because I'd made sure Linda had my cell number and strict instructions that only I could authorize changes. Elena, you look absolutely radiant. Margaret is going to die when she sees you. No, she's not going to die. She's going to learn that underestimating me was the biggest mistake she could have made. As we left the hotel and headed to my house for the ceremony, I felt lighter than I had in months. Margaret's sabotage had been meant to break me, to prove that I didn't belong in her family, to show David that I couldn't handle family stress with grace and maturity. Instead, it had done the opposite. It had shown me exactly how strong I was, how well I could handle a crisis, and how little power she actually had over my happiness. She'd tried to take away my wedding day, and instead, she'd given me the gift of absolute clarity about who she was and what our relationship would be going forward. What Margaret didn't know, what no one except Carmen knew, was that I'd been documenting everything for months. Not because I'm paranoid or vindictive, but because 15 years of running a business had taught me that sometimes you need evidence to protect yourself from people who operate in bad faith. It started innocently enough, right after the first flower incident. I'd begun keeping a simple log of Margaret's interference, dates, times, exactly what she'd said and done. Initially, it was just for my own sanity, a way to track the pattern of behavior that David couldn't see because he was too close to it. But as her sabotage attempts escalated, I realized I was building something much more valuable than a personal record. I was creating a comprehensive documentation of psychological manipulation and deliberate sabotage. The log lived in a locked folder on my laptop, backed up to the cloud, with supporting evidence that would make any skeptic a believer. I had screenshots of text messages where Margaret contradicted herself, audio recordings of phone conversations where she said one thing to me and something completely different to David, receipts from vendors showing the unauthorized changes she'd made, even a few emails where she'd been careless enough to put her real feelings about me in writing. But the dress destruction was just the latest in a campaign that had actually started long before our engagement. What David didn't know was that Margaret had been quietly investigating me for months before he proposed. She'd driven by my house, looked up my business records, even called my ex-husband under the pretense of being a potential client who wanted to verify my character references. She'd done everything short of hiring a private investigator, and she probably would have done that too if she'd had the budget. I knew about all of this because Margaret had made one crucial mistake. She'd involved my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, in her reconnaissance mission. Mrs. Chen, who was 78 and had been watching out for me since my divorce, had called me 3 months ago with a story that initially seemed amusing but quickly became alarming. "Elena, dear, the strangest thing happened yesterday. A woman came to my door asking about you. Said she was David's mother and wanted to know what kind of neighbor you were. Asked all sorts of questions about your visitors, your schedule, whether you took good care of your property." "What kind of questions?" "Oh, you know, whether you had men over frequently, whether you kept odd hours, whether your business brought unwanted traffic to the neighborhood. The kinds of questions someone asks when they're looking for dirt." Mrs. Chen had been around long enough to recognize a fishing expedition when she saw one. She'd given Margaret nothing but glowing reviews, but she'd also paid attention to Margaret's car, her license plate, and the fact that she'd come back twice more to observe my house when she thought no one was watching. I didn't like her energy, Elena. She felt like someone looking for reasons to disapprove. I'd thanked Mrs. Chen and thought that was the end of it. But then Sarah mentioned, almost in passing, that her grandmother had been asking a lot of questions about me and my past relationships. And David told me that his mother had offered to do a background check on me just to be safe, because you never really know someone until you investigate them properly. That's when I realized Margaret wasn't just being protective. She was conducting opposition research, looking for ammunition to use against me when the time was right. So I'd started conducting a little research of my own. It turns out Margaret Hayes had quite the history of driving away her son's romantic prospects. David's relationship with Rebecca had been the exception, not the rule. Before Rebecca, there had been 3 other serious relationships that had ended abruptly, all with women who'd complained about his overbearing mother before disappearing from his life. I'd found this out through some careful social media archaeology and a few strategic conversations with longtime family friends who were happy to share stories about Margaret's past behavior once they realized. I was genuinely interested in understanding the family dynamics. Jennifer Walsh, who'd dated David for 2 years in his 20s, had left after Margaret convinced her that David would never prioritize a wife over his mother's needs. Lisa Chen, no. Relation to my neighbor, had been driven away by a campaign of subtle criticism and boundary violations that sounded remarkably familiar. Maria Santos had lasted 18 months before Margaret's interference became unbearable. The pattern was always the same. Margaret would start with small boundary violations and helpful criticism. She'd escalate to more direct interference and manipulation. If the woman didn't break up with David voluntarily, Margaret would manufacture a crisis or create drama that forced David to choose between his mother and his girlfriend. And David, who'd been programmed since childhood to prioritize his mother's emotional needs, would always choose Margaret. Rebecca had been different only because she'd died before Margaret could drive her away. In fact, from what I'd learned, from family friends, Margaret had been ramping up her usual tactics when Rebecca's cancer diagnosis shifted everyone's priorities. Margaret's grief over Rebecca's death was real, but it was complicated by the fact that Rebecca had been the only woman who'd ever successfully challenged her control over David's life. Now Margaret was facing the prospect of another woman taking that position, and she was pulling out all the stops to prevent it. But what Margaret didn't understand was that I wasn't Jennifer or Lisa or Maria. I was a 47-year-old woman who'd built a successful business from scratch, survived a difficult divorce, and spent years learning to recognize manipulation tactics. I'd dealt with difficult clients, unreasonable vendors, and entitled relatives who thought they could bully me into compliance. Margaret's behavior was textbook psychological manipulation, and I'd seen it all before. More importantly, I'd prepared for it. The backup dress was just the most visible part of my preparation. I'd also quietly secured backup vendors for every aspect of the wedding. Vendors that Margaret didn't know about and couldn't interfere with. When she'd changed the cake order, I'd already had a conversation with a second bakery about making an emergency cake if needed. When she'd tried to alter the flower arrangements, Linda Martinez had already been instructed to confirm any changes directly with me. I'd even prepared for the possibility that Margaret might try to sabotage the venue itself. My friend Rosa, who managed the catering company we'd hired, had been discreetly briefed about potential family drama and given instructions to ignore any last-minute changes that didn't come directly from David or me. But my most important preparation had been emotional and psychological. I'd spent months building up my confidence, reminding myself of my worth, and practicing responses to Margaret's tactics that would keep me calm and centered instead of reactive and defensive. I'd worked with a therapist to understand the manipulation patterns I was seeing and develop strategies for protecting my mental health while navigating a toxic family dynamic. Dr. Sandra Martinez, Yes, Sacramento has a lot of Martinez families, had helped me understand that Margaret's behavior wasn't really about me at all. It was about her need to control David and her terror of being displaced in his affections. The specific attacks on me were almost arbitrary. Margaret would have found fault with any woman David chose to marry, because the real threat wasn't my personality or my character. It was my very existence as a potential primary relationship in David's life. "She's not trying to get rid of you because you're wrong for David," Dr. Martinez had explained. "She's trying to get rid of you because you're a threat to her position as the most important woman in his life. If you were perfect in every way, she'd find different reasons to object, because the objection isn't really about you." That understanding had been liberating. It meant I could stop trying to win Margaret's approval and focus instead on protecting myself and my relationship with David from her interference. The dress destruction was actually a gift in a twisted way. It was such an obviously malicious act that it would be impossible for Margaret to explain away, and it gave me clear evidence of just how far she was willing to go to sabotage my happiness. The careful documentation I'd been keeping would make it impossible for her to gaslight David or anyone else about what had really happened. But the real ace up my sleeve wasn't the evidence I'd collected or the backup plans I'd made. It was the conversation I'd had with David's sister Patricia 3 weeks ago. Patricia lived in Portland and rarely visited, but she'd made a special trip to Sacramento to meet me and assess the family situation. David adored his younger sister and trusted her judgment completely. If Patricia approved of me, David would feel confident that his choice was right, regardless of what his mother thought. Patricia turned out to be nothing like Margaret. She was warm, direct, and refreshingly honest about her mother's controlling behavior. "David's told me some of what Mom's been doing," she'd said over dinner at a quiet restaurant downtown. "I want you to know that her behavior isn't normal or acceptable, and it's not your fault." Has she always been like this? Always. She drove away every girlfriend David ever had before Rebecca, and she would have driven Rebecca away too if Rebecca hadn't gotten sick. Mom can't stand not being the center of David's universe. How did Rebecca handle it? Patricia smiled. Rebecca was a force of nature. She just ignored Mom's games and focused on David. But she also had the advantage of being 25 and having nothing to lose. You're in a different position. You're trying to build a life with David and become part of our family. Mom's counting on that, making you more vulnerable to her manipulation. So what do I do? Document everything. Don't let her gaslight you into thinking you're imagining it or being too sensitive. And don't expect David to see it clearly. He's been trained since childhood to accommodate her behavior, and he has a blind spot where she's concerned. Patricia had also shared something crucial. Margaret had been telling David for months that I was too old for him, too set in my ways, and not the right fit for Sarah. She'd been planting seeds of doubt about our compatibility while being sweetly supportive to my face. "David's been defending you, but Mom's been persistent. She's convinced that you're going to make him unhappy and that he's only marrying you because he's lonely and settling for less than he deserves." That conversation had been the final piece of the puzzle. Margaret wasn't just trying to sabotage our wedding. She was trying to sabotage our entire relationship by undermining David's confidence in his choice and my confidence in his commitment. But Patricia had also given me hope. "David's happier than I've seen him since Rebecca died. He talks about you constantly, and it's obvious that he loves you deeply. Don't let Mom convince you otherwise, and don't let her drive you away like she did the others." The dress destruction was Margaret's nuclear option, her final attempt to create enough chaos and drama to derail the wedding entirely. She was counting on me being devastated, dependent on her help, and willing to postpone the ceremony rather than walk down the aisle in something hastily purchased and inappropriate. Instead, I was going to walk down the aisle looking absolutely stunning in a dress she'd never seen, proving that her sabotage had accomplished nothing except revealing her true character to everyone who mattered. And thanks to the comprehensive documentation, I'd been keeping. I had everything I needed to make sure that Margaret's behavior had consequences that extended far beyond this one day. The moment I stepped out of my car at my house on Saturday morning, I could see Margaret pacing in my driveway, clutching what looked like a garment bag and checking her watch frantically. She was dressed in an understated navy dress that somehow managed to look both elegant and disapproving. Classic Margaret. Her face was tight with the kind of controlled panic that meant her carefully laid plans weren't unfolding as expected. She spotted me immediately and rushed over, her voice pitched with false concern. "Elena, thank goodness you're here. I've been trying to reach you all morning. I brought you several dress options from my favorite boutique. The owner opened early as a special favor. We need to get you changed quickly if we're going to have time for alterations." I looked at Margaret standing there with her emergency dress selection, and I almost felt sorry for her. She'd spent the entire night convinced that she'd won, that I'd be grateful for her help, dependent on her rescue, forced to accept whatever scraps of dignity she decided to offer me. Instead, I walked past her toward my front door, keys in hand, looking completely calm and put together. "Thank you, Margaret, but that won't be necessary. I have everything I need." She followed me, confusion evident in her voice. "But Elena, your dress was ruined. We need to find you something appropriate to wear. I've selected several options that would be suitable for a woman of your age and the occasion." There it was again. Suitable for a woman of your age. The subtle insult wrapped in helpful concern. "I appreciate your thoughtfulness, but I'm all set." Margaret's confusion was shifting to alarm. "Elena, I don't think you understand the severity of the situation. Your dress was completely destroyed. These things happen, but we need to be practical about finding a solution." I turned to face her on my front porch, and for the first time all morning, I smiled. "Margaret, I need to ask you something. When you destroyed my dress last night, did you really think I wouldn't have a backup plan?" The blood drained from her face. "I don't know what you mean. There was an accident." "Margaret." My voice was gentle but firm. "I know exactly what happened last night. I have photos of the damage, and anyone who looks at them will know that wasn't an accident. The cuts were too precise, too systematic. There was no collapsed closet rod, no broken metal, and certainly no accidental stains." She opened her mouth to protest, but I continued. "I also know about your little investigation into my background 3 months ago. Mrs. Chen told me all about your visits. I know about the unauthorized changes you made to my flower order, my cake order, and every other detail you tried to control. I know about the phone calls you made to vendors claiming to speak for me." Margaret's face had gone from pale to ashen. "Elena, I think you're misunderstanding." "I'm not misunderstanding anything. I've been documenting your behavior for months. Every incident, every manipulation, every attempt to sabotage my wedding. I have dates, times, witnesses, and evidence that would convince anyone that your behavior has been deliberate and malicious." The carefully constructed mask of concerned innocence finally slipped, and for just a moment, I saw the real Margaret, angry, entitled, and absolutely furious that her plan had failed. "You can't prove anything," she said, her voice cold. "Actually, I can. But that's not what matters today. What matters today is that your attempt to ruin my wedding has failed completely. I'm going to marry your son in 2 hours, wearing a beautiful dress that you've never seen, in a ceremony that you couldn't sabotage no matter how hard you tried." I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out how I could possibly have a dress when she'd destroyed the only one she knew about. "You're bluffing. There's no way you could have found something appropriate on such short notice." "Margaret, did it never occur to you that a woman who runs an event planning business might have contingency plans for emergencies? Did you really think I'd put all my eggs in one basket, especially after you'd already shown me exactly who you are?" The realization hit her like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on destroying the one dress she knew about that she'd never considered the possibility that I might have prepared for her sabotage. "You knew I would." She stopped herself, realizing she'd almost confessed. I knew you would. Try something, yes. I just wasn't sure what form it would take. The dress destruction was actually more dramatic than I expected, but not more effective. Carmen appeared on the porch behind me, radiant in her matron of honor dress, carrying my bouquet. Elena, the photographer's here, and David just texted that he's at the venue. Are you ready to get gorgeous and marry the man of your dreams? Margaret watched this exchange with growing horror, finally understanding that her nuclear option had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience in my carefully planned day. Elena, wait. We need to talk about this. As family, we should be able to work through our differences. We are family, Margaret, or we will be in 2 hours. And as family, we're going to establish some new boundaries. Your interference in my relationship with David ends today. Your attempts to control his life and mine end today. Your sabotage and manipulation end today. I don't know what you think you're accomplishing with these accusations. I'm not accomplishing anything, Margaret. I'm simply making it clear that I see exactly who you are and what you've been doing, and I'm not going to tolerate it anymore. David deserves better than a mother who tries to sabotage his happiness. Sarah deserves better than a grandmother who creates family drama and puts children in the middle of adult conflicts. And I deserve better than a mother-in-law who thinks destroying my wedding dress is an acceptable way to express her disapproval. Margaret stood there holding her garment bag of emergency dresses, finally understanding that her carefully orchestrated crisis had accomplished nothing except exposing her true nature to someone who was never going to be intimidated by her tactics. David, we'll hear about this conversation. I'm counting on it. In fact, I'm planning to tell him everything. About the dress, about your investigation into my background, about all the vendor changes you made without authorization. He deserves to know the truth about what his mother has been doing to try to sabotage his happiness. Margaret's face went through several expressions before settling on cold fury. You have no idea what you're dealing with. I've been part of this family for 48 years. David will never choose you over me. Margaret, I'm not asking him to choose. I'm just asking him to see the truth about your behavior and help establish healthy boundaries for our marriage. If you can't respect those boundaries, then yes, he'll have to make some difficult decisions about how much access you have to our life together. With that, I walked into my house and closed the door, leaving Margaret standing in my driveway with her useless emergency dresses and her failed sabotage plan. An hour later, I was standing in my bedroom, putting the finishing touches on my makeup while Carmen zipped up the champagne silk dress. In the mirror, I looked radiant, happy, confident, and absolutely beautiful. The dress was even more stunning than I'd remembered, and it fit like it had been made specifically for this moment. Elena, you look incredible. Margaret is going to die when she sees you. Margaret is going to learn that underestimating me was the biggest mistake she could have made. Sarah knocked on my bedroom door, then peeked in with a huge smile on her face. Elena, you look amazing. Dad's going to cry when he sees you. Are you ready? The guests are all seated and the music's about to start. As we walked through my house, toward the back garden, I could see through the windows that everything was perfect. The white roses and eucalyptus were exactly as I'd envisioned. The small collection of chairs was arranged beautifully around the makeshift altar David had built. Against the backdrop of my climbing rose trellis, and our closest friends and family were gathered to witness the beginning of our new life together. And there, in the front row, was Margaret, wearing her navy dress and a smile that looked like it had been painted on with a shaking hand. She'd arrived with her emergency dresses and found that they weren't needed, that her sabotage had failed completely, and that I was about to marry her son despite her best efforts to prevent it. The music started, and Carmen began her walk down the garden path. Sarah followed with her basket of rose petals, glowing with excitement about her father's happiness. And then it was my turn. I stepped out onto the garden path, and I could hear the collective intake of breath from our guests. The champagne dress caught the afternoon light beautifully, and I felt like the most beautiful bride in the world. Not because I was young or perfect, but because I was a woman who knew her worth and had fought for her happiness. David was waiting for me at the altar, and when he saw me, his face lit up with such pure joy that everything else faded away. Margaret's sabotage, the destroyed dress, the months of manipulation, none of it mattered in that moment. All that mattered was the man who loved me walking toward me with tears in his eyes and a smile that could power the entire city. But as I passed Margaret's chair, I caught her eye for just a moment. Her face was pale, her smile was strained, and her hands were clutched tightly in her lap. She'd realized that not only had her sabotage failed, but that I'd been prepared for it, all along. She was facing the reality that her new daughter-in-law was not a woman who could be bullied, manipulated, or driven away. The ceremony was perfect. David and I exchanged vows that made everyone cry, including his mother, though I suspected her. Tears were more about the failure of her plans than the beauty of the moment. We kissed as husband and wife, while our friends and family cheered, and I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with proving Margaret wrong and everything to do with proving myself right. Let anyone else define my worth or control my choices. Right to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. And right to believe that sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is simply refusing to be broken by it. As we celebrated, in my garden that evening, surrounded by people who genuinely loved and supported us, Margaret was notably quiet. She made appropriate small talk and posed for family photos, but the fight had gone out of her. She'd played her trump card and discovered it was worthless against an opponent who'd been planning for her attack all along. The next morning, David and I found a note that had been slipped under our hotel room door. It was from Margaret, and it was brief. David and Elena, I owe you both an apology. My behavior has been unacceptable, and I realize I nearly ruined something beautiful because of my own fears about change. Elena, you handled my interference with more grace than I deserved. I hope we can start fresh when you return from your honeymoon. Congratulations on your marriage. It wasn't a full confession or a complete acknowledgement of what she'd done, but it was a start. More importantly, it was proof that Margaret finally understood she was dealing with a woman who couldn't be intimidated or driven away. David read the note with a mixture of relief and embarrassment. Elena, I'm so sorry about my mother's behavior. I had no idea how bad it had gotten. I know you didn't, but now you do, and that's what matters. We can move forward from here. And we did. Margaret never again tried to interfere with our marriage or our decisions. She learned to ask rather than assume, to suggest rather than demand, and to respect the boundaries we established as a couple. It wasn't always easy, and she slipped up occasionally, but she never again underestimated my ability to protect myself and my marriage from her manipulation. 6 months later, when she asked if she could help plan Sarah's graduation party, I said yes, but with clear guidelines about her role and my final approval on all decisions. She followed the guidelines perfectly. Sometimes the best way to handle a bully is to show them that you're not afraid of their worst-case scenario. Margaret's nuclear option, destroying my wedding dress hours before the ceremony, had been designed to devastate me, to prove that she held the real power in the family dynamic. Instead, it proved that I was a woman who plans for contingencies, who doesn't crumble under pressure, and who understands that true power comes from being prepared rather than being reactive. Margaret learned that day that she wasn't dealing with a victim or a pushover. She was dealing with Elena Hayes, a woman who knew her worth and wasn't going to let anyone else determine her happiness. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever dealt with someone who tried to sabotage your happiness or undermine your worth, I want you to know that you have more power than you think. Document the behavior. Prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. And never let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve the happiness you're fighting for. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories about standing up to bullies, protecting your boundaries, and refusing to let anyone else write your story. Because your happiness is worth fighting for, and you're stronger than the people who want to tear you down.